Today we have with us Ms. Johanna Dasteel. She is the American Life League's Senior Congressional Liaison and directs the organization's Personhood Project, an educational and advocacy effort to define the term person in state and federal constitutions to include every human being. For the past 3 years, she has led the American Life League's presence on Capitol Hill and has educated members of Congress on how to advance the rights and personhood of the preborn and the need to defund Planned Parenthood. She also manages the American Life League's efforts with state personhood initiatives, personhood educational efforts, and state and federal legislative analysis. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Dasteel.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you all hear me? I don't have a really great projecting voice, but can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Tell me if I decrease my volume at any point. Anyway, as he said, I'm Johanna, and I do our legislative work on Capitol Hill. And as he also said, I work on personhood, but also on the Defunding Planned Parenthood, our Defunding Planned Parenthood project. Have you guys seen Planned Parenthood in the media lately? What have you seen them in the media for? Why? Because of Obama. Does anyone else, what else have you heard about Planned Parenthood in the news? Yes, go ahead.
Congress just went through a big debate where they almost defunded Planned Parenthood.
That's right. Well, the House did vote to defund Planned Parenthood by a pretty large margin, but the Senate actually did vote on it, which we didn't necessarily expect, and it was voted down. But getting the good vote in the House is a good step for us. But anyway, I talk about Planned Parenthood just to lead into, I guess, what we face in our opposition as pro-lifers. And as you may have heard from Planned Parenthood a lot, they were calling us extremists pretty often, so were their friends in Congress. And it's not a new tactic. I've faced that a lot in the personhood initiative process, being called an anti-choice extremist, that we're waging a war on women. Planned Parenthood was saying that a lot in the defunding Planned Parenthood debate, and we hear that a lot when we're doing state personhood initiatives. So while it isn't a new tactic, and that's pretty ugly, them name calling like that, I think it's a good sign for us because it means they have no convincing arguments left, again, in response to ours. So when it comes to personhood amendments, and I'll get into, I don't know if you guys have heard a lot about them. Have you? Do you know much about personhood amendments? No? Okay, well, I'll get into that. But when it comes to those amendments, we find that Planned Parenthood has no other recourse than to incite fear through exaggerated and ultimately unfounded claims of what these initiatives would do. They don't actually argue against the language of the initiatives, which I'm going to show to you in a second. They use scare tactics and diverting tactics and things of that nature. So just to get an idea of what personhood is, in conceptually, personhood is the concept, it's the legal recognition of an entity's full status as a person. So right now in the United States, corporations are considered persons, as legal persons. They're protected by our laws as legal persons. They have rights as legal persons. That's how it's articulated in our laws. But as pro-life advocates, we are advocating for this, that personhood is the legal recognition of a human being's full status as a person. Right now, as you know, not every human being is protected as one. So the personhood movement is essentially a two-pronged approach. We are seeking this legal recognition through laws. So we're trying to affect change in our laws. But it's also an educational effort. And these aren't mutually exclusive efforts, the legal and educational laws in themselves and pursuit of passing laws is an educational effort. But we won't get to those passing of laws without educating the nation, educating our state, educating our local communities. And that's where this applies to you. When you think of being pro-life in these terms, and when you get back to the basics, this is a human rights movement. And if we want to pass these laws, if we want to bring back legal protection for the preborn, because they used to be legally protected, if we want to do that, we have to speak the language of our culture in order to change it. And our culture very much cares about human rights. And this is a human rights initiative process. So when all the amendments seek to do is define human beings as persons, to argue that some human beings should not be recognized as persons really smacks of discrimination, doesn't it? Yeah, it's pretty prejudiced. And this usually warrants a collective shunning by society, but we know that in the case of abortion, it hasn't, because people don't think of the preborn as people. And that's our job, to rehumanize them, because they have been so dehumanized by our culture. I mean, we hear in the personhood movement, babies referred to as blobs of tissue, as just little specks, as products of conception, anything except for what they actually are. Children, they're human beings, they're people. So the simplicity, back to Planned Parenthood a little bit. Planned Parenthood cannot go the route of facing this head on because of that obvious discrimination, that to say that some human beings aren't people, I mean, it would be too obvious of what their agenda is, so they don't go that route. And the simplicity and common sense of these amendments is a painful exposure of the secret that Planned Parenthood has worked so hard for so long to keep hidden, that they are a racist organization. And it's founded in eugenics. Maybe you recognize her? Who is this?
Margaret Sanger.
That is. Do you guys know much about her?
She started Planned Parenthood.
That's right. Margaret Sanger was a racist, unabashedly a racist, and eugenicist. She ran in the same crowds as people who advised Hitler. I mean, that was a eugenics program. The Nazi Germany was a eugenics experiment for Germany. So with Planned Parenthood being rooted in this, they can't face things head on and expose what they've hidden for so long, this history that's come through to today, perpetuated by a religion of secular humanism. Are you guys aware of secular humanism? It's basically what informs our morally relativistic society, elevating man to the status of God. We make rules, we make ethics. We're not held to a higher standard, held to a higher law. So this, and also population control, which Margaret Sanger was also very much in support of. She used to do she started off doing charity work, and then she got fed up basically and thought that, well, we just need to get rid of poor people, not help them. So Personhood Amendments, again, are written in the plain language, defining every human being as a person. And so plain and common sense are they that when I've approached people on the street doing grassroots petition signature gathering to get these amendments on the ballots, they ask me why we need to pass something that's so obvious. I mean, isn't every human being protected as a person already? Why do we need to do something like this? And it's too reasonable to not already be a guiding principle in our laws, but for shame, it's not. So why is this effort necessary? Well, in 1965, there was the Griswold v. Connecticut decision, which basically was the lead-in to Roe versus Wade. Found the right to privacy in the shadows of our Constitution. So basically, it's not actually in our Constitution, it was just made up. And as a foundation, this was referred to in Roe v. Wade as reason enough to make human beings property again. And you'll see this if you ever listen to the oral arguments of Roe versus Wade. They talk about, well, is the fetus property, or is the fetus a person? Is the fetus property or a person? They go back and forth a lot. And basically, this is what ushered in decriminalized abortion in the United States.
You would agree, I suppose, that one of the important factors that has to be considered in this case is what rights, if any, does the unborn fetus have?
That's correct. So of
Was it
course,
critical to your case that the fetus not be a person under the due process clause?
it seems to me that it is critical first that we prove this is a fundamental interest on the behalf of the woman, that it is a constitutional right.
Well,
And
yes, but how about the fetus?
Okay, and second, that the state has no compelling state interest. Okay, and the state is alleging a compelling state interest.
Yes, but I'm just asking you, under the federal Constitution, is the fetus a person for the purpose of the protection of the due process clause?
All of the cases, the prior history of this statute, the common law history would indicate that it is not. The state has shown no,
Well, what if would you lose your case if the fetus was a person?
then you would have a balancing of interests.
If it were established that an unborn fetus is a person within the protection of the 14th Amendment, you would have almost an impossible case here, would you
I
not?
would have a very difficult
You certainly would, because you'd have the same kind of thing. You'd have to say that this would be the equivalent to after a child was born. If the mother thought it bothered her health having a child around, she could have it killed. Isn't that correct?
They didn't come to their decision uninformed, and there were amicus briefs. Those are briefs that are written by attorneys. Many pro-life attorneys sent in amicus briefs, friends of the court, to help inform the Supreme Court justices on what exactly they were ruling on and giving them the information they needed to make those decisions. They were given the evidence of fetal development, embryonic development. They were shown empirically that we're talking about not things, not just cells, but actually human organisms, people. They still argued it out in the oral arguments a bit, as you heard. But when they said that there was no precedent, meaning there were no other laws already in effect, there were no court decisions that didn't respect the fetus, the human being as a person, that wasn't true. And they actually touched into this a little bit in other parts of the oral arguments. I mean, unborn children did have property rights, entitlement rights. I mean, they could inherit. They had inheritance rights. So a preborn child, if their father died or something, they could inherit the estate even while still in utero. They still had claim to that. So these things existed, but they said that doesn't matter though, because that's only upon birth that they can claim rights to that property. So in ignoring a lot of this, they also did have pretty reasonable arguments, not saying they were ethical arguments, but the fact that we'll see that they talked about there was no legal precedent for the fetus being regarded as a person in the full sense in the terms of inalienable rights, because the Texas law that was being argued in Roe versus Wade actually had exceptions. And most laws being proposed right now, being promoted as pro-life laws, have exceptions. But we see in footnote 54 that this is the crux of Roe versus Wade. In footnote 54, they cite that the Texas law had exceptions, and thus, if you don't treat every human being as a person, I mean, if you say that sometimes abortion is acceptable, sometimes it's okay, then you must not really think the human being is a person, pro-lifers. So why do you expect us to treat them like that? So here is the first part of it's 2 paragraphs, and I just brought up the first one. When Texas urges that a fetus is entitled to 14th Amendment protection as a person, it faces a dilemma. Neither in Texas nor in any other state are all abortions prohibited. Despite broad prescription, meaning broad bans, an exception always exists. And you would see later that in Texas it was in the case of saving the life of the mother. But if the fetus is a person who is not to be deprived of life without due process of law, and if the mother's condition is the sole determinant, does not the Texas exception appear to be out of line with the amendment's command? They're talking about the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that establishes equal rights, right? Are you guys getting the severity of the situation when it comes to exceptions? It's just further entrenching the idea that not all human beings are people, and that we're not rooting our pro-life advocacy in a human rights cause. and further entrenching. Anytime we have exceptions, we're just playing into Roe versus Wade and further entrenching it.